Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade. A lot has happened, and it is time for the War Master and the Crusade at large to take stock of the situation. Having narrowly avoided defeat, War Master Macaroth had at long last managed to break the fortress world of Moorland in late 773. Pretty much simultaneously with the final refusal of the Chaos attempt to decapitate the Imperial Crusade, with victories on Khan III, Enothis, and of course most importantly of all, on Herodor. After the Saints' legendary victory in that conflict, and the killing of a Chaos Magister, she rushed to join the War Master at the front line, as she had so long been requested to do, and continue the further persecution of the Chaos War Master Gaur. And many commanders of the hastily organized Second Front now assumed that they would swiftly be called upon to join the Saint and the War Master in the assault forward. For surely, now that the threat to the Crusades' flank had been stopped, the only thing that remained to do was to proceed forward into the sanguinary worlds and put an end to the Chaos threat in the Sabbat sector once and for all. But the War Master had a very different view of events. As far as he was concerned, the Chaos enemy had displayed a remarkable ability to fight an effective two-front war with a highly decentralized command structure. He viewed Chaos now not simply as one unified whole under the command of the Gaur, but rather two separate and almost equal threats. Gaur was technically the Archon of the Chaos forces, and thus supposedly, presumably, the unquestioned supreme commander, as, generally speaking, Chaos war hosts tend to have only one leader, as any more than one leader tends to lead to conflicts of a rather brutal and immediate nature. Chaos warlords are not ones to share power, and yet that appeared to have been precisely what had happened here. Anaquanar Sek was quite clearly acting largely independently of his Archon. Otherwise, surely the Gaur would have called upon the massive resources at the Magister's command to reinforce him at Moorland and the Fortress Worlds. Instead, no major movement of troops from one front to the other had been detected at all, not in either direction. The Gaur had not come to the rescue of any of the failing Magisters on the flank assault. Simultaneously, none of them had sent any forces to aid the Gaur either. It had initially been assumed that this was simply because it had been how the front had been divided. But upon closer scrutiny, the War Master finds operating virtually entirely separately. Presumably, at most, the Gaur needed to sign off on the various plans of Anaquanar Sek. But other than that, he was operating near entirely separately from the Gaur. This would normally have been an excellent opportunity, of course, for the War Master to crush one or the other. His enemy was separated, either for reasons of politics, or simple unwillingness to aid one another, or whatever. They were not fighting as a unified whole. Surely this was an opportunity to surge forward and destroy one of them. But which one? And what would be the consequences of doing so? Macaroth's previous dilemma had not really fully cleared up. He had been hesitant to call off the attack on Moorland for fear of the Gaur's resurgence. He had been equally hesitant to call upon further reinforcements from the Second Front for fear of Anaquanar Sek. Well, he'd seized one fortress world, but as far as the War Master knew, the Gaur was still as powerful as ever, and Sek, after the fall of the other Chaos Magisters, simply seemed to have taken their war hosts into his own. he was still faced with two distinct threats, and he could still not turn wholly upon either one without the other falling him in the rear. Or, quite pithily, as the War Master himself was said to have put it, I consider neither one of them to be entirely harmless. And so the solution, unintuitive though it most certainly appeared to be, was to not defeat either enemy. At the very least, not yet. Not to focus either on the Manchester or on the Gaur, but rather to solidify and make official the arrangement that had already been made. The Crusade would be split into two fronts. The primary assault that would continue under the command of War Master Macaroth, and the Coreward assault, which would be the new second front, which would continue its assault upon Anaquanar Sec. Now, this was no longer a purely defensive measure, of course, by hastily thrown together Imperial formations. It was now an official command with an official mandate to continue to prosecute the war against Anaquanar Sec, and to defeat him as soon as they were able. A lot of the Imperial commanders did not view it this way, however. Most of the other leaders saw this as an opportunity that Macaroth was now willfully throwing away. The enemy was beaten. Urlok Gaur, at the very least, must surely have been shattered after Morland. And Anaquanar Sec, what could he do? All the Chaos Magisters had already fallen on the flank assault. The Saint was with the Crusade. Surely this was merely just a mopping up action by now, and any true glory came not in hunting down some lieutenant, but in hunting down and killing the Gaur. You can imagine a lot of commanders were quite outraged at the idea that they would remain at the second front, the rearward areas for simple administrative mop-up duty, whilst yet further young, unproven generals was brought up alongside Macaroth. Lord Militant Sibon in particular was outraged by this, having sent an official letter to the War Master reading, "Have I not killed enough for you, my bloodthirsty lord? Why do you unman me with this dismal janitory role? Must I be forced to follow your glory, pace by pace cleaning up the debris you leave in your wake, while you grant trust in lesser men to piece the enemy's heart worlds?" Macaroth's response to this outraged overture was simple. Yes. It's to the point and pithy, no doubt about that, but it earned him no friends whatsoever. If anything, it only increased the numbers of his enemies, including General Blackwood, another oft-proven leader of the war, who, upon being ordered to join the Coreward assault, the second front, was reported to have said, "I would, sire, but there's nothing on the Rimworld line." His objections, too, fell on deaf ears, and he was dispatched alongside Sibon to, as they viewed it, pick up the pieces. Once again, the War Master's uncanny ability to create enemies and alienate friends is on full display. However, he did have a point, as was to be proven fairly soon thereafter, in the year 774. You see, a major threat to the Imperial Crusade was developing on a backwater world of little importance by the name of Gereon. This planet had been largely bypassed by the initial Chaos conquests of the Sabbat worlds, and had thus been left alone until the Chaos assault upon the Imperial Crusade's flank began. At which point, Gereon, like so many other worlds, was simply swept up in the Chaos advance, quickly overwhelmed and occupied. to be pillaged of its resources to feed the ever-moving war front. It had the displeasure of being occupied by Anaquanar Sec, who instituted a brutal occupation regime as the world was to quite literally be stripped of everything of worth. Its water, its populace, its food, its infrastructure, its raw resources, you name it, Chaos was intending to steal literally all of it. But even more importantly was the presence of Lord General Notches Sturm. How exactly did this come to pass exactly? The more cerebral amongst you might remember that the Lord Militant was the commander during the battle for Vervun Hive. However, nearing the end of the siege, he attempted to, flee his post outright, and was supposed to be executed by Ibrahim Gaunt for this. But Notchestem asked the Commissar to be allowed to, execute himself, to leave this life with honor. Instead of doing that, he turned the proffered bolt pistol upon Gaunt, lost an arm for it, and was then hauled away in chains to receive an official trial awaiting proper execution. A waste of time if you ask me, and a dangerous waste of time as well, as the Lord Militant's transport had been intercepted by Chaos forces. One of countless Imperial Navy vessels, no doubt, caught up in the Blitzkrieg-style advance of the flank attack. Now, obviously, the Lord Militant had been heavily brain-locked before transportation, because there were a lot of secrets in that head of his. A lot of secrets, now all in the risk of falling into the hands of Chaos. As far as the Imperium knew, they had not done so yet. However, the mind lock was strong, placed upon him by several potent psykers, and unraveling it would be next to impossible, but next to impossible simply means extraordinarily difficult and requiring of someone with adequate determination. Anaquanar Sec was a warlord both with ample resources and determination, and so a plan was hatched to assassinate the Lord Militant. Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt requested the duty because he felt responsible for not having carried out the sentence during the battle for the Vun Hive, and, yes, I suppose, although this also meant that he would have to abandon his beloved ghosts, as they could host a small infiltration operation. Gaunt would have to pick a handful of followers and leave the rest of the Tarnith in the gentle hands of the Imperial war machine. And decapitating much of his current leadership to bring with him to Gereon, Gaunt went off into the galaxy to adventure and to correct his own private mistakes. Now, don't get me wrong, I admire the zeal to correct one's own errors, but this also, again, practically decapitated the Tarnith first and only, and would actually end with them being rolled up into another regiment because, they couldn't really function as a cohesive unit anymore. But details, eh? Gaunt's team arrived on Gereon and began making contact with local resistance fighters, who had been organizing in various cells for quite some time already, despite, or perhaps because of, the brutal Chaos occupation, which largely consisted of locally recruited exhibitors. These were the usual, turncoats and traitors one find within any occupied civilization, or nation in general, in fact. When your world or your country is occupied by an enemy that appears by all reasonable standards to be undefeatable, at the very least for a handful of civilians with pitchforks and the occasional flintlock musket, A lot of people are, unsurprisingly so, going to feel tempted to join the occupation rather than the resistance fighters, whose cause already appears doomed. The exhibitors were no doubt given preferential treatment, their families spared the worst of the horrors, and they would not have to sign up for the meat lottery, where people from every community were selected at random to be sent off to factories, where they would be rendered down to their component parts. But Chaos also has a few other unique ways with which to occupy a world, many of which Gaunt and his men ran into during their infiltration mission, such as the glyphs, hovering pseudo-magical balls of warp energy that hover around looking for signs of disturbances. And if they find some, they would awaken wire wolves. Now these are rather fascinating creatures from an inquisitorial standpoint. See, it has long been a practice of Chaos to imbue otherwise mundane items with malignant spirits. In essence, that is what a demon weapon is. It is a sword with a demon inside of it. Makes sense. And so surely many have long speculated that there could be some way to bind these entities to other things as well, rather than simply just weapons. And indeed, many such efforts have been taken over the years. Experiments with demon hosts, for example, is in essence that, to bind the demonic entity to a fleshy form. Certain chapters of the Adeptus Astartes have taken this to its logical extreme. Listen. The exorcists have done nothing wrong in the eyes of this Inquisitor. But then again, I also consider the Marine Malevolence to be some of the best guys in the Imperium, so take my opinion there with a pinch of salt, I do suppose. Anywho, the idea here is to create a skeleton, a series of metal strips that form the rough outline of a werewolf-like creature. Each one of these strips will have ritualistic wards bound and etched into the steel, so as to be able to contain the warp energies, at least for a while before burning out. The biggest problem here, really, is that, the creatures of the warp are fickle entities that tend to not function very well in the real world. And so the energy requirements of binding a demon even temporarily to the mortal coil are significant, and usually requires mass sacrifices, lengthy chants, sermons, or the correct prayers, or at the very least a suitably worthy vessel that can contain their power. Not some random scrap you find lying around and then you proceed to write funny little words into it. But clearly, the warpsmiths of Anaquanar Sec had found some way to inscribe this metal with just enough robustness to contain the essence of a warp-born demon for a little while, enough to tear to absolute shreds any would-be resistance fighters it encountered. Not to mention, it is a fantastic terror weapon. Can you imagine a better way to crack down upon resistance cells than to make it not only ridiculously dangerous, but absurdly scary as well to venture out during the night? With the fear of literal monsters from beyond the veil awakening to tear you limb from limb? It is rather diabolically clever. It's a good reason why Anaquanar Sec is often described as one of the more cerebral Chaos Warlords, because he thinks about stuff like that. Gaunt's mission did not work out particularly well to begin with, honestly. They ran into resistance almost immediately and started fighting their way towards their objective long before they wanted to. The whole infiltration thing practically failing within hours of them arriving on planet. So much for the vaunted stealth of the Tarnith person only, I do suppose. Although, to be fair, they were weighed down with some local resistance fighter as well. This ended with Gaunt and his merry band being driven into a vast area of swampland on Gereon known as the Until. This was an area near universally avoided by the locals because it was home to strange creatures and weird religious zealots, separatists in fact, that were not on the Imperium's side at all. Remnants of some previous population of Gereon that had resisted the coming of the Imperium. The area was therefore avoided by anyone and everyone and referred to as such, the Until, the untillable area, as in non-fertile, non-growable, etc. Gaunt and his crew, however, was getting rather desperate, as they had hunters on their heels, including Chaos Space Marines. Oh boy, okay then. I take it this is the last chapter in Gaunt's story. No. You see, in the Until, the resistance fighters ran into the Night Gain. These were the survivors of some old human civilization. They did not like the Gereonites, they did not like the Imperium, but they liked chaos even less. At the very least, when Chaos arrived at their camp deep in the Until and started slaughtering them. As a squad of Chaos Space Marines descended upon these barbarian savages, armed with nothing more than, well, crossbows basically, magnetically launched, so probably with a decent muscle velocity, but not a whole lot more, and a handful of ghosts and Gaunt himself. By all rights, that should have been all of them dead, but as we have seen on multiple occasions previously, Gaunt is, rather lucky. Rather lucky indeed. And not only survived the encounter, but killed all of the Chaos Space Marines. I gotta admit, I find this entire encounter to be somewhat unreasonable, but oh well. Now, we should probably return to the actual point of the excursion to Gereon, the mission to kill Noche Sturm. Considering all of the noise and havoc and general chaos that Gaunt had kicked up, you would think this mission to be pretty impossible at this point. But no, it was carried out successfully. Even better, in fact, Gaunt arrived just around the time when Sturm's final brain lock was released. In the nick of time, he found the general. And this time, the general asked for a weapon yet again, and Gaunt, again, decided to hand him one. You'd think he'd be learning from his mistakes, but this time it was not a mistake. Sturm had remembered everything that he was. He had remembered that he was a Lord Militant, that he was an honest and honorable, relatively speaking, loyal servant of the throne, of the God Emperor. And he took the honorable way out by blowing his own brains out, thus securing his secrets from the arch-enemy's grasp. And this was not a foregone conclusion, mind you, as during his stay on Gereon, Noche Sturm had been treated relatively well, and had been convinced by his captors that it was the Imperium who had betrayed him, and that it was only correct that he embrace the hospitality of his new friends and help them defeat the vile, evil, bigoted empire. He had even engaged in many long conversations with a commander of an entirely new military unit, the Sons of Sek. This commander was Mabon, Eto Gaur, with the Eto Gaur being his official title. Mabon had conversed with Noche Sturm, both on matters about philosophy, tactics, military matters, and so on, as Noches was all ready to give up everything. It was only when the last mind lock was released and him being given an opportunity at redemption that he took it. Had Gaunt and his men not been there is a decent chance that he would have decided to continue to embrace his new friends, as the Lord Militant would probably have been given an elevated position within Sek's new army. This, by the way, was probably Gaunt's most significant contribution to the campaign on Gereon and for the Second Front, the discovery of the Sons of Sek. See, Anaquinar Sek had realized that his army of maddened cultist zealots were not the equal of the Gaur's blood pact, and the recent assault upon the Imperium's flank having failed near completely at every step, despite the enemy's forces being divided and separated, had proven to him at long last, finally, that he needed to change his army. Screaming zealots were all well and good when one was winning, when one was simply just overrunning the scattered remnants of imperial bureaucracy. It was not good enough to meet the Emperor's armies in the field of battle, as war after war had been lost due to their lack of discipline. And Nothis having been the latest example, where his own forces, albeit massively outnumbering the enemy, had been beaten back with enormous casualties on every front, in the air, on the ground, and in the sea. Quite clearly, despite the previous embracing of the old adage, quantity has a quality all of its own, it was not enough to defeat the Imperial Guard. And so, Sek set about copying the Guard, and copying the Blood Pact too, and doing it better than both. His Sons of Sek would be trained by the very best he could get his hands on, not just previous Imperial Guard fighters, but also those who had joined his ranks from the Blood Pact. Mabon Etogar was just one such example. He had been an Imperial officer first, then he had joined the Gaur's Blood Pact, and then he had been turned to the service of Anaquinar Sek. No doubt Sek must have been very careful with this, as it would quickly become all too obvious to the Gaur what he was planning, which might easily shatter the truce, alliance, cooperative agreement that the two had come to. Clearly, however, it was worth the risk, and if you could turn a Lord Militant, even better. That would not only allow him to train troopers, but to train generals, to train colonels, to train commanders, to construct a proper, full-scale army. Luckily for the Imperium, he was at least denied that resource, even if only temporarily, as the Sons of Sek themselves were quite frightening. They were even more elite than the Blood Pack, selected only from the fittest and largest examples of those serving in the Magister's ranks. They were huge, brutish stormtroopers of tremendous both mental and physical stature, having been trained to obey orders absolutely and without question, to walk into a hail of lasfire if necessary, but also retaining the tactical understanding of how to utilize the extra meters gained. If it was necessary to sacrifice 10 men to a heavy bolter so that the 11th could get to toss a grenade, then that is what they would do. And on Gereon, Sek had ample opportunity to test his new troops against the local resistance fighters, giving them a taste of real action against enemy fighters armed with outdated weaponry, sure, but still a determined lot. As when the Sons marched into an entire hamlet and started putting the entire civilian populace to the sword, the fighters emerged from hiding to try and save the civilian populace. This combat practice was invaluable for making sure that the Sun's tactics and their leadership style was sufficiently advanced to meet the Imperial Guard, and it also allowed Sec to continue to maintain secrecy, as none would live to tell the tale of the Sun's deployment. None other than the Colonel Commissar, of course, and for the time being, it appeared as if he and his men would be stuck on Gereon forever. And they were stuck on Gereon for quite some time. But the Colonel Commissar would eventually manage to effect an escape, to warn the Imperial Crusade about this new threat brewing on its flank. Thus, you can see that the War Master was, yet again, correct. Neither the Gaur or Anaquanar Sec could be fully discounted as threats to the entirety of the Imperial Crusade. They both still had the potential to deliver devastating defeats to the Imperial forces, and neither one could be defeated swiftly enough to guarantee that the other would not fall upon the overextended flank of the Crusade. Macaroth's only true failing was yet again to not adequately communicate this to his gosh darn commanders. When one of your Lord Middletons writes a long, outraged poetic screed to you, and then goes through the trouble of mailing it across a star system's distance, you are indeed expected to reply with more than a simple, yeah. This was Macaroth's greatest threat in all due reality. The greatest danger to the War Master was his own soldiers, his own commanders, who would now, yet again, resume their own plots and schemes against the War Master because they felt betrayed. They felt abandoned, they felt overlooked, and they felt as if the War Master himself had completely lost the plot. What do you mean we're gonna divide our forces? The enemy is weak. Why do we give them the opportunity to catch their breath, to reorganize? And the War Master simply shrugging and going, because I say so. Was just not quite good enough. But the move against the War Master was still quite some whiles in the future. Coming next, we have a rather hectic period as 774 dawns on the horizon, and one of the busiest periods of the Crusade begins. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.